Welcome to the GeoIgnite session called Mind the Gap. My name is Calvin Klatt. I'm the Chief Geodesist of the Government of Canada, and I'm the Director of the Canadian Geodetic Survey. We'll be discussing the gap, or what is a pending reference frame difference between Canada and the United States. I'll switch to screen sharing here, and go. Okay, so mind the gap. Try that again. I will be discussing a bit about the context in Canada for geodesy, and some background on reference systems, reference frames, some of the sense of why we need to change. Part of our driver is that the United States has made the decision to change, so we'll be discussing that. And we'll look at really how Canada will address the gap. Either we eliminate the gap by following and doing what the United States is doing, or we manage the reference frame difference. And finally, we'll end with a call for your input, because fundamentally we're in a position where we need more information on how this affects geospatial data users, managers in Canada to proceed. So I guess just a bit of background. We say in this business, all positioning is with respect to something, and for geospatial information, that is a geodetic reference frame that you position yourself to. The frames are variations of what is the defining characteristics are in a system, and the frames are the variations, the practical realizations of the systems. So you can see my little lightning strike there, and is that it has one position, but in the two different systems, A or B there, measuring systems, it can have different numerical values. So the world is not that complex, it's just simply the ruler has slid over a little bit, and there's perhaps sometimes a distortion, compression, and offset, rotation, etc. between the frames. I'm going to discuss a bit of the difference between a system and a frame. A system, reference system, like the Canadian Spatial Reference System, is a set of defining characteristics. So it sort of lays out how positioning will be done in a theoretical fashion. The frames are practical realizations of that system. So, so most of our clients would be interested in the frames. So they're using a variation of NAD83 CSRS. And we update the frames periodically because new data comes in, and we can provide more precise information, all of which meets the definition of that system. The systems very rarely change. So we had NAD27 in Canada, then we had NAD83 original, and then we had NAD83 CSRS. That was a fairly significant change there. And now we're talking about a new reference system. So over a period of 100 years, there have been only 3 such systems so far. But there have been many frames. So we'll see version 7 of the CSRS was released this past summer by the Canadian Geodetic Survey. In the 1920s, I'm going to go back in history, and I just happened to be reading some old reports from a previous director of the Geodetic Survey, and there was some other reasons why I was interested in this particular international report. I guess one of the reasons was we actually provided the same report to more or less the same international organization last summer, 2019 summer. So I was looking back at a report provided nearly 100 years earlier. But in that report, I noticed this discussion about the Canadian datum. This was a 2-dimensional datum without the height system, and how that was going to be tied to the U.S. datum, and that the director noted that this would resolve the datum question in Canada for all time. So that datum, that system, eventually became what we call NAD27. Most of you know that NAD27 was highly distorted because of the technologies they used. It's all very local. There were no satellites in place that you could. Well, there was one, but it was a natural one and wasn't that useful. So you didn't get, you didn't have GPS in those days. So the NAD27 system did not last forever like the director would have liked. It was eliminated when NAD83 came along, although there are instances where NAD27 remains the system of choice required by government for one purpose or another. Some of that is offshore oil and gas, and the other would be the city of Toronto still uses NAD27. So these systems do not last forever. The frames, again, we update every couple of years. The systems rarely change, and I should say here that we've been consistent with the United States really in terms of the geometric positioning. We've been consistent really since the 1920s. So 100 years of pretty much complete consistency with the United States. And there have been different, realizations of that, which differ by, centimeters at times. The Canadian Spatial Reference System, just so we get that, understand all of what that entails, there's the NAD83 CSRS, which I was just discussing, the US NAD27 to NAD83, and now it's NAD83 CSRS. That's a three-dimensional geometric positioning. It's insensitive to the Earth's gravity field and doesn't represent where the heights will not represent where water will flow. They're with respect to the Earth's shape to a best fit ellipsoid. We also are responsible for heights above sea level, which represent where water will flow, and we now use a surface of constant geopotential value, or a geoid, to represent this standard reference system. And our system is the Canadian Geodetic Vertical Datum of 2013. And we also, the Canadian Geodetic Survey is responsible for national gravity standards as well. We won't discuss that any further, but that is a responsibility of the geodetic agencies. In Canada, the kind of provision of geodetic services is not the federal government's responsibility solely. It is something that is done through the Canadian Geodetic Reference System Committee, which is a federal, provincial, territorial subcommittee of a larger group called the Canada Council on Geomatics. So there are also other players. Obviously, I mentioned the City of Toronto. There are commercial service providers which provide positioning, very precise positioning in the frame required, which can be differ between provinces. Academia is extremely important in Canada. We have one of the, historically we're one of the world leaders in geodesy and academia, and they provide services as well. And the user communities. So we really can't, I think we've kind of reached out to provinces, the federal government, the commercial service providers. I think we understand their desire to change to a system that's consistent between regions and across international borders. Academia, but we require more input from the user community, which is sort of why I'm here today. This is a comparison of where we are today with respect to the United States, because obviously the driver of this is a decision made in the United States. So right now, the NAD83 CSRS, which is the geometric system we have, and now it's currently in version 7, that is roughly equivalent as a system to the North American Datum 83, the NSRS, the National Spatial Reference System in the US. So the 2011 is part of the frame. So the systems are identical. In terms of vertical, that's heights above sea level, there have been significant differences between the two countries. Prior to the introduction of the North American Vertical Datum of 1988 in the United States, the two countries had equivalent vertical positioning, although they differed in some important ways and maybe were not really identical in some systems. There were significant differences between them. If you extended the US version over into the Canadian side, you would find that they were not so good. When the United States introduced NAV D88, Canada chose not to go. It was the cost of changing was too high for what we considered a minor improvement, because NAV D88 was seen to have significant distortions on its own. So we retained an older system, but in 2013 we moved to a new vertical datum. Canadian Geodetic Vertical Datum 2013. So there is a significant difference in these height systems, and that is something that causes blunders in the Red River flooding situations, for example, where you have two different systems on different sides of the Canada-US border. So the times are changing. So back in the 20s, we were using very traditional surveying equipment. Now we are using not just GPS or GLONASS, we're using Galileo compass. We're receiving data from really the 4 constellations now. Positioning is becoming more and more precise, more and more reliable as we have more and more satellites in the sky above us. This is sort of driving down the requirements for the systems, that they should be more and more consistent with each other, because any slight variations cause the client headaches. And also the realization the frames, it now matters a lot more how precise the frames are. So if you're using an old version of the spatial reference system in Canada, the errors are more significant. So today we are able to obtain positioning below 10 centimeters. This is 10 centimeters, an interesting number because it's roughly the number we hear that the autonomous vehicle market requires. So it's a number that has real world implications. 10 centimeters is, 10 centimeters is much smaller, in fact, than the differences between some very commonly used reference systems. So in this case, the raw GPS information is in WGS84, World Geodetic System 1984, and NAD83 is tied to the North American plate and has other problems with it in terms of its definition. And so those two are more than a meter different in large parts of Canada, and that is suddenly something we can't ignore. When people are getting several meter real-time positioning, that 1 meter difference didn't matter. Now it's a huge difference. I mentioned autonomous vehicles. That's sort of the truck in the center. We also have autonomous agriculture. So robotic agriculture is something that is coming. The Geodetic Agency in the UK has worked with other stakeholders to provide positioning for that application specifically. And there are other, more consumer applications, such as this robotic lawnmower. So I mentioned the NAD27 and the hopes that would last forever. It didn't. Then we introduced NAD83 and then NAD83 CSRS, which was an important update to that, or NSRS in the United States. But now we've realized that the NAD83 CSRS, the system, the defining characteristics, have some errors in them. In particular, there's an error in the origin of the system. So the geocenter is not where we would like, and it is offset by 2 meters. That means that that there's a kind of an offset that varies geospatially between those two systems, and then the sort of modern, the international standards that are discussed at the United Nations in terms of how various countries should adopt those international standards. Those are seen here in the black. The Natura F2022 would be consistent with that. The ITRF, the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, and the GPS system. So NAD83 now is no longer meeting international standards and is causing varying differences in position between those two frames. Back, we're now going to complete our discussion on the geodetic reference system changes, or mind the gap. I'll just switch over to sharing of the screen. Yes, so mind the gap. So we've been discussing the reference frames, and I noted here that there was this offset between kind of the modern international standards and NAD 83, and that causes a varying difference between the frames. That difference, and it's on the order of a couple meters at the Earth center and a couple 1.5 meters or so in parts of Canada. So this difference and some other aspects about the nature of NAD 83 have caused the United States to make the decision to change the system, something that we do every, as I noted, every 50 years or so, but it is maybe time. So the United States has decided that they'll move to a new system called Natura F2022, which will change those defining characteristics, such as the location of the geocenter. It will improve the model of the North American plate motion, and will incorporate a better understanding of some of the dynamics of the planet Earth. They will also change their height system, the heights above sea level. This is the geopotential datum that I mentioned. So they will be moving to a new geoid height system called NAP-GD 2022, which is the North American Pacific Geopotential Datum of 2022, and that will replace NAVD 88. Remember that NAVD 88 was never adopted in Canada, so this one is more of a good news matter. So as I mentioned, that the US changing their height system is good news for us, because really their new geopotential datum will be equivalent to the existing system in Canada, that's the Canadian Vertical Datum of 2013. So they're essentially using a geoid-based system, as we have done, and they have chosen the same geopotential value, which is critical, otherwise there would be an offset. So they've chosen the same reference point, essentially, and the two systems will be consistent with each other, and perhaps they may in fact be the same actual geoid model at that point. We may update our frame to our realization of that system to be exactly the same realization that they use. So our system will remain the same, but we may have a small update, which will be a frame. The bad news is, and I've been alluding to this, is that the spatial reference system, the geometric system, NAD 83, will no longer match Natura F2022. So they'll be, because they're changing that geopotential location and a number of other small factors, these two will not be the same. And this would be, if Canada does not change, will be the first time really in our history that we've not had a consistent frame in this geometric frame with the United States. And I won't refer much to the geopotential datum, because that really is kind of a solved problem now. That was an issue in the past, but by the US adopting a datum that matches Canada, that's sort of there's really no issue there. We do not require any changes. I'll just continue along discussing really these terrestrial geometric frames, NAD 83 and Natura F2022. So why did they change? And I think the logic is really that it's more compatible with really the GPS frames. You can actually model out those effects, the various effects, one of which is that geopotential offset. Another one is the motion of the North American plate. These can all be kind of, modeled out, but the offset between them, and it's sort of a continually changing shift between the frames, is something that they just felt was not something that we should be living with in this century. So they will incorporate, as I might have mentioned, better understanding of the Earth's dynamics. So they will have better information on intraplate dynamics and the geoid the rate of change of the geoid, not just the geoid, but how this geopotential is changing with mass variations of the Earth. So Canada would, if Canada were to adopt this frame, we would adopt those features as well. So we have been, because Canada is actually a bit more dynamic place because of the glacial isostatic rebound, we probably are in a fairly good position to adopt those dynamic Earth issues. The plate will be, the new reference frame of the US will be fixed to the North American plate. So there'll be very few, very little motion will need to be modeled out, because that would just be deformations of the plate rather than errors in the plate motion or how the whole plate is moving relative to the planet Earth. And it's just a part of their white paper is really this concern that a major offset between GPS positioning and the NAD83 datum. And I mentioned the dynamics of the Earth, and it's something that we, in geodesy, we're very aware of this, but we know that our clients prefer not to be aware of this. They would like to have a position and it never change. And so in effect, we did that with NAD83, with NAD27. In NAD83 CSRS, we can see that there was an effort, obviously, to tie it to the North American plate, but it was not done very well. So there are errors in that. But we also have a lot of other changes. So we really need to, in the long run, we'll need to understand that reference frames, the Earth is dynamic and is changing, and in the reference system, and eventually coordinates will be changing, and the meter stick has to sort of remain in one place, and we will look at all of the things changing within that system. So those differences between NAD83 and Natura F2022, they are kind of on the order of a meter horizontally through much of Canada. You can see sort of some of the lines, and sorry for the poor graphics, and vertically, kind of on the order of a meter to half a meter or less vertically. So this is between NAD83 and Natura F2022. So if we were to kind of ignore them, you would have to make these kind of corrections at the border, and they're not consistent. It's not consistently 1.5 meters. It's obviously goes from more than that in Vancouver to less than that in central Canada. So they can be modeled out, but we, so that is one option, is to leave it as is and deal with this, or we can adopt the Natura F2022. So we, one of the concerns is that people will make blunders by using the wrong reference frame in the wrong context, or reference system in the wrong context. So here, here's a driver on the wrong side of the road. I kind of think that this is more of a comic relief than real, but it is a fact that automobile companies have discussed with myself reference systems, the difference between them, and how the US is changing reference systems and what those implications are. So this is a matter of real world interest to automobile manufacturers who are dealing with increasingly automated vehicles, even if they're not fully autonomous at this point. Well, this is obviously a graphic, not a real photograph, and it's also comic relief in a way, but we also know of many situations where the reference frames have not been effectively considered, and the differences between them have caused problems. So we know of that in real life within our agency. So what are we doing? How are we preparing? So first off, the actual reference, the two reference systems, the height system and the Natura F2022 system, we're working very closely with our US counterpart in defining those systems. So we're working with them on the geoid modeling, so that when we produce a new version of our height system and they produce a new system altogether, that there's no big issues for Canada, that it suits Canada well. Similarly with the geometric one, we're working with them. We're making sure that all the transformations, all the defining characteristics are in place and that it's suitable for our adoption should we choose to use it. Within Natural Resources Canada Geodetic Survey, our positioning tools will allow positioning in that in the Natura F2022 system. The tools will be available to shift between datums. So really, the client will have the option of using it whether it's formally adopted or not. We also know that the commercial providers of service of tools will, like Esri, for example, they'll also have tools embedded within them to manipulate these frames. So we've been reaching out to the public on the situation. We've been other stakeholder engagement, land survey associations, for example, and we are here at GeoIgnite 2020. There's been a fair amount of engagement within government, in the federal government, and I mentioned the transportation issue, but Transport Canada is interested in this issue, which is sort of a new stakeholder, as well as all of the more traditional groups like Fisheries and Oceans and the mapping agencies within Natural Resources Canada. So been a fair amount of engagement there. No decision has yet been made. And obviously, the provincial governments are part of the National Reference Frame Committee, the CSRS, and they're working with us on developing that plan for Canada. So I mentioned that there are these many different frames, and unfortunately, they're versions of the Canadian Spatial Reference System. And you can see this map here where we see different adoptions of different versions. So version 2 with an epoch, which allows you to adjust for intraplate motion, deformation, and in fact, in practical terms, the error in the defining characteristics of this spatial system. And you see up to version 6, the preferred version of the Government of Canada, federal government, is version 7 right now, which came out just last year. So we have these differences and we have the different epochs. So it actually creates barriers to trade and complexity for people providing services to surveyors who want to provide real-time kinematic services near interprovincial borders where there are different systems in place, different frames in place. Also, there are municipalities are a key player here because they themselves have control over what system they use. So it would be good if we could really work with them and provide a system that everyone kind of moves to. So this maybe Natura F2022 is the system where we'll all move together and have consistent position across the country. Perhaps that's a dream. I'll note though that in the 1920s we learned that we said that the reference system hopefully would last forever, and we know that it didn't. There were subsequent changes. We know for a fact that one day NAT 83 CSRS will have to change. So I like to say it's not a matter of if we'll change it, but exactly when. Is this the time now? And I think maybe these considerations are enough to make this the time. Otherwise, we simply deal with the border offsets, and actually it's sort of the clients who would have to deal with the border offsets. So, I guess this is kind of how we view it. I guess mostly the Canadian federal government, but also the provincial partners in delivering the spatial reference system. We see that if we modernize to Natura F2022 in the near future, there are less risk for blunders in terms of using GPS and this Natura F2022, the GPS inherent natural frame of WGS84. There's potential for compatibility across Canada. So if we sort of all move together to a new system, it would be quite a relief for many. Compatibility with the US and better support for all of the new automated vehicles, etc. I note, though, it's neither a pro or a con, but the actual pure relative accuracy of positioning will not be changing. So you're not actually going to get better positioning, you just will have more consistency within the frame. So the frame is not actually going to be better in a certain sense. If you were to be an expert geodesist and you moved using all the proper tools between the frames, you'll find that actually it's not fundamentally more accurate. And then the cons are obviously data migration costs, and this is something we don't really know how big those are. That depends on you, really, people who are managing geospatial data. So that is really the key question. Who, those costs are not borne by us. The geodetic agencies will, provide all of the transformation tools. So in a sense, all of the costs are going to be, we're going to make the investments one way or another. And if it's kind of becomes the national standard, then the data will have to migrate. And it doesn't have to migrate in a day or a year or 5 years. We know, in fact, that it takes many years to migrate data from one system to another. There's still, I'm sure, plenty of data in the 1927 reference frame. So we do want to hear your voices. We want to know what are those costs to migrate your data, but also the cost of managing a situation where the US and Canada are offset by 1.5 meters or thereabouts. That's also a cost that we would not be bearing. So if that creates blunders and mismanagement or complexity in map making or management of data near the US-Canada border, that's also a cost that we will not bear. So we need to know kind of, from the people who will pay the costs, how they would like to go forward with this. So, we're going to be obviously getting ready for the US's move. They've now delayed that for a few years, so we have a bit of time. There's a really clear potential for us to change Datum's systems at the same time. We're preparing all of this technical work. As I mentioned, the Datums will be available in all of our services and tools. And then the other part is really we need to work with stakeholders and with our partners in the provincial governments and territorial governments to make a decision on really a path forward. And ideally, that would involve consistency across Canada. And we need to find a way to maintain a unified system across Canada. If we can achieve that, we would really want to find a way to make sure that it's maintained in the long term. So really the question is, what are your views on this modernization? Do you prefer to deal with 1 meter or so offset at the border, or are you ready to plunge in and make one of those once-a-lifetime reference system changes to become compatible with the US and compatible with the international standards? So in the Q&A stream, we'll be adding a few links and more information. And I refer back to that document. There was a document in Geomatica that is made available for free to users. So you won't have to pay the fees for Geomatica. So we thank Geomatica for that. And it is available in English and French. So that's it. And let's now move on to the question and answer process.
Thank you all very, very much. And thank you very much to Calvin for an exciting and very interesting presentation. So I have noticed that we have some questions coming in. So just a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A icon where you can enter your questions that will be directly sent to Calvin and Calvin will be able to answer them. So we right away have one from Denis, with the first question being that although NATRF is time tagged as 2022, is it realistic to think that US will adopt it in 2024?
So does my audio work? Just check that before I go too far.
Yes, it does. Wonderful.
Okay. We spoke very recently to the National Geodetic Survey in NOAA in Washington. The epoch, the defining epoch will be 2022, and they are, so like NAD 83, it was not necessarily introduced in 1983, it actually sort of came out a bit later. So they're talking about 2025 for the introduction, or 2024. So they're hedging their bets. They're not actually fixing a firm date for that because they've had a number of delays with their airborne gravity data collection and other matters. So I think 2025, to my understanding, is a reasonable date, but it is dependent on a lot of factors, including the COVID-19 situation.
Wonderful. And to follow up, Denis has a few additional questions. So is the WO of CGVD 2013 and NAPGD 2022 the same?
So, they will have the same defining sort of fundamental definitions, so defining characteristics. So the systems will be exactly the same. As we're obviously they're doing the modeling, the building that geoid model, and we're working with them very closely. So my colleagues in Canada, and so there may be a model in Canada and a model in the U.S. The two will be very close at the border. So just like essentially small and it depends, I guess, if we find that there's a North American model that's not as good as our Canadian one, we will be reluctant to go to that. Like, we want to see an improvement, but in but fundamentally they will be very similar. The definition of them will be the same, and how they're sort of the model that's actually practically used may vary very slightly. So I think the answer is they'll be essentially identical. And like within the Canadian Spatial Reference System today, there are small updates occasionally. So that would be the kind of thing you'd see if there are two different models. It would be just a small difference of that sort. Like usually those are related to improvements of data or different data being used in the different models.
Wonderful. Tying back to the first NATRF question, so what is the position of the provinces and territories with respect to adoption or not of NATRF 2022 in Canada?
The position is not yet defined. Within the Geodetic Reference System Committee, I believe that all of the provincial representatives on that are in favor of changing to Natura F2022. However, they're not necessarily in a position of authority to make the final decision. Generally, we have relied on the Canada Council on Geomatics, which is a higher level committee, to make that decision. We're a bit we're aware of the fact that the user community has changed. So, for example, Transport Canada is now very engaged in reference frames, as are some automobile manufacturers. So there's some differences, I think, in terms of who the stakeholders are now. So we have to be very aware of that. But I think that fundamentally the decision will probably come down to a discussion at the Canada Council for Geomatics, and that's has not yet occurred. So there's sort of no formal position at this point.
Wonderful. And the final question that I have on behalf of Denis is, will and when will NRCan CGS recommend federal adoption of NATRF 2022?
I think that I guess there's this question of, well, what us recommending, but I think it's really going to be a question of what happens among that community of the geospatial community. So we would like to kind of have a decision. Ideally, we had hoped to bring this up for discussion at the Canada Council for Geomatics this year, 2020, or perhaps 2021 to have a decision made. So that may be delayed because obviously that meeting is not happening as it normally would. But we would like to have a decision by sort of mid-2021, and I think that would allow us, I believe that would allow us time to introduce it with the United States. And noting, of course, that it takes many years generally for people to make the full change. So there's a point where we officially announce it, and then obviously takes quite a bit of time. So I think that's reasonable for us to make a decision by next year, and it's reasonable for us to say that the implementation is at a certain time, that would mean that all of the related information is available, all the tools and services are available, and then that would allow the clients to begin the transition. So we wouldn't require instant transition by everybody by 2025 or so. I think it's actually feasible for us to implement right hand in hand with the United States. And I think that would alleviate a lot of issues. I think that there are concerns, like certainly in ocean science, which frame are you in, so I think it would be better to really go with them at the same time and deal with the issues together, hand in hand with them.
Wonderful. So we have time for one last question. And for anybody who has any additional questions or anything they would like to add or ask specifically, please feel free to utilize our Slack platform to continue this conversation, as it's a great way to stay interactive with one another. The final question that I have for you is from Tanya. And would the decision to migrate to different reference frames be dependent on organization's application? For some practical applications, the offset might not matter much as compared to the others, say military, aerial survey, etc. Would Canada still allow both the existing reference frame systems and the modernized versions to remain?
I think in practical terms, we still have users in NAD27, and we have so I think that's correct. I think that there's no need to like if your uncertainties are in the tens of meters, as part of my example there in the past, then you don't need to worry about a 1 meter shift, basically. So the frames are, for all intents and purposes, the same. So there's no need to worry about that. And there is a requirement, like the fundamental benefit of geodesy is the compatibility of information. So we would not want to have many different frames out there. They're all incompatible, so data cannot be shared between one user and data collected at one time with data collected 20, 30 years later. The whole point of geodesy is that by creating frames and managing how they are consistent across space and across time, it allows compatibility of information collected whenever, wherever, for whatever purposes, and it allows it all to be integrated in some manner that was never anticipated. So that's the benefit of geodesy, and that's why geodesy is usually funded by the taxpayer for these what we call positive externalities, so benefits that accrue to the public in general. So having people use different frames does create problems, but if essentially they are, if it's within the kind of error, if your error budget is very large, then essentially the two frames are the same. So the data is compatible in that situation. But we definitely would want to caution that there's a very significant economic benefit from having what we call universal compatibility of data. It's the foundation of why we pay for geodesy as taxpayers, and we wouldn't want to lose that benefit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but as I mentioned, please continue this conversation with our Slack channel. This is definitely a very interesting topic, and glad to see that we have so many questions from our audience. So our session will continue in the other Zoom room, room 1, at 12:30, which is in about 15 minutes Eastern time. This channel will remain open for until the next session later this afternoon, but feel free to hop onto the other room. Thank you all so much for participating, and thank you very much, Calvin, for your time.
Thank you very much.